My family believed that local law enforcement would always turn a blind eye to what happened in our home, but they never anticipated federal investigators quietly building cases that stretched across 5 different states. Growing up in my family meant understanding from a very young age that the men in our household expected one daughter from every generation to live in a specially constructed soundproof room in our basement, serving as what they called the family's emotional release valve. My grandfather constructed that room with his own hands back in 1967, spending weeks ensuring the walls were thick enough, the door heavy enough, and the soundproofing complete enough that nothing from inside could ever reach the outside world. He had grown up in a household where he watched his own father beat his mother until she lost consciousness on countless occasions, where he witnessed his brothers terrorizing their wives with such regularity that it seemed like just another part of daily family life. So somewhere along the way, he came up with what he genuinely considered to be an innovative solution, something he actually called the humanitarian answer to generational violence. His idea was that one girl, carefully selected when she reached the age of 18, would absorb all of the family's rage and frustration and cruelty, becoming a designated target so that other women in the family could supposedly live free from random acts of violence. The chosen one wore a locked silver anklet that could never be removed and lived in that basement room every single day and night without exception. Whenever anyone in the family felt angry or stressed or simply wanted to exercise cruelty, they had a specific person to direct those feelings toward. My grandfather truly believed in his heart that this system protected the other women in our family from experiencing violence unpredictably, and he convinced himself that this made him progressive in some twisted way. 4 generations of men had grown up viewing this arrangement as normal and necessary. My father, my uncles, my older male cousins. They had all been taught from the time they were small children that the basement girl existed specifically for their anger and frustration. They would accompany their fathers down those stairs when they were just boys, learning which types of strikes left visible marks and which ones didn't, which techniques caused the most pain without requiring medical intervention. By the time they reached their teenage years, they each received their own keys to that basement room, and the cycle continued as naturally as passing down a family recipe. When I was young, I thought about calling the police so many times, but they had spent years making sure I was too terrified to ever actually do it. Instead of hearing normal bedtime stories like other children, I grew up listening to detailed accounts of the foster care system, hearing over and over again about how if I ever called the authorities, I would end up in that system where terrible things would happen to me, where I would be hurt in ways that would make our family situation seem gentle by comparison. And it wasn't like the women in our family were innocent bystanders who disapproved of what they called the humanitarian system either. My grandmother held the responsibility of selecting which girl would serve next. My mother performed the anklet ceremonies with a sense of solemn duty. My aunts delivered meals through the slot in the door 3 times a day, telling younger girls in the family that being chosen was both an honor and a necessity. They believed without question that without this anger room, as they sometimes called it, things would be so much worse for everyone. I was only 10 years old when my Aunt Rebecca was chosen for service. I remember watching them lead her down to the basement on the morning of her 18th birthday, watching her own parents hand their daughter over like she was some kind of sacrifice to an ancient god. The tradition followed very specific rules that had been refined over decades. The selected girl served from age 18 until she either died or became so incapacitated that she could no longer fulfill her role, and then the next girl was chosen immediately afterward with absolutely no gaps allowed in the system. My grandmother maintained incredibly detailed records going back to when my grandfather first built the room. She kept notebooks filled with information about which girl served during which years, how long each one lasted, and what she called performance ratings that evaluated how well each girl absorbed the family's violence. She showed me these records once when I was about 14, displaying them with genuine pride in her organizational skills and thoroughness. When I was 15 years old, my Aunt Rebecca was replaced by my cousin Christina. Every single morning before heading to his job at the manufacturing plant, my uncle would visit the basement room for 20 minutes. Wednesdays were specifically designated as my father's scheduled time after he got home from work. Weekends belonged entirely to my grandfather, who was retired by then and seemed to have more energy for these visits than anyone else. The women visited the basement too, though less frequently than the men did. They would go down there to deliver lectures about gratitude and duty, to explain why this sacrifice was necessary for the greater good of the family. All the family's frustrations and disappointments and rage funneled into that single room, and everyone acted like this was the most natural thing in the world. It was around this time, when I was 15 going on 16, that I was finally old enough and clever enough to discover something that would ultimately change everything for all of us. The heating vents connected every single room in our large house to each other, creating a network of passages for warm air that also carried sound if you knew exactly where to listen and how to position yourself. Through those vents, I realized I could hear Christina begging and crying during the scheduled visits that happened with clockwork regularity. I heard the sounds of what was happening to her in explicit, horrifying detail that I will never be able to forget, no matter how many years pass. I heard the impact of fists against flesh. I heard her screaming for them to stop, her voice growing hoarse and broken. I heard my uncle's voice, cold and clinical, explaining to his son which techniques caused the most pain without leaving permanent visible damage. I heard my grandmother sitting in the living room directly above the basement, explaining to my 11-year-old cousin Jessica that she might be blessed with selection one day soon, that she should prepare herself mentally and spiritually for such an honor. She spoke in the same tone she used to describe how to bake bread or arrange flowers, as if selecting a child for systematic abuse was just another household task to be passed down through generations. That was the precise moment when I started recording absolutely everything I could capture through those vents, when I realized that someone outside our family needed to hear what I was hearing. For 8 long months, I collected evidence hidden within the ventilation system, being extraordinarily careful never to let anyone discover what I was doing. I used my babysitting money to buy small recording devices, the kind you could order online without raising suspicions. I learned how to position them inside the vents where they would not be visible but would capture clear audio. I created a system for changing batteries and retrieving memory cards, always watching for patterns in when people were out of the house. I recruited 10 younger female cousins who were terrified of being chosen next, girls who understood with absolute clarity that they were potential future victims, that any one of them could be selected at any time. Sophia, who was 16 and the oldest of the younger cousins, mapped out the entire ventilation system for us, creating detailed diagrams showing which vents connected to which rooms, where the best listening points were located. She spent weeks crawling through the attic, measuring distances, testing sound quality. Amanda, who was 14 and had always been good with her hands, learned to pick various locks by watching videos online and ordering practice sets, spending hours every night practicing until she could open almost anything in under 30 seconds. She said the clicking sounds of locks opening helped her feel less powerless, gave her something concrete she could master when everything else felt out of control. We figured out how to drop medical supplies down to Christina through the ventilation grates using a rope system that Amanda designed. Band-aids, antibacterial cream, painkillers we stole from our parents' medicine cabinets. We documented her injuries by taking photographs through the openings whenever we could manage it without being caught. Angles were difficult, but we made it work. Christina would position herself under the grates during specific times when she knew we would be there, and we developed a code system using knocks to communicate. 2 knocks meant guards were nearby. 3 knocks meant it was safe. 4 knocks meant emergency. We were building a case without really understanding legal terminology or proper evidence collection, just knowing in our hearts that what was happening was deeply wrong, and that someone outside our family needed to see irrefutable proof. We knew that words alone would not be enough, that our family's reputation and money would protect them from simple accusations. We needed evidence that could not be explained away or dismissed. The breaking point arrived at our annual Christmas dinner celebration, an event that our family held at my grandparents' massive house with all 42 extended family members present, including distant cousins and in-laws. The house was decorated elaborately as always, with a 12-foot tree in the living room and garlands wrapped around every banister. My grandmother had spent days preparing food, making everything from scratch according to recipes passed down through generations, the same recipes that had been used during countless celebrations where girls had been selected for the basement. The contrast between the holiday cheer and what I knew was about to happen made my stomach churn. My grandmother stood up from her seat at the head of the table with the ceremonial selection bell, a small silver bell that had been used for this purpose since 1967. The room fell silent immediately. everyone understanding what that bell meant. Christina had served admirably for 3.5 years, she announced while gesturing toward a list of what she called achievements, metrics she had been tracking like a manager evaluating an employee. But Christina had sustained multiple injuries that were affecting her ability to fulfill her role effectively, she continued, her tone matter-of-fact, as if Christina's broken ribs and fractured wrist were simply job performance issues rather than evidence of systematic torture. It was time to choose her replacement because the family could not function without someone serving in the room, she explained, and there could be no gaps in service. Her eyes moved slowly around the room, lingering on each of the younger girls, building suspense and fear. The selection was supposed to feel random, even though we all knew it was calculated. The younger girls sat frozen, some trying to make themselves smaller, others forcing smiles, hoping that showing enthusiasm might protect them. My grandmother's gaze finally settled on 11-year-old Jessica, who smiled back innocently because she had been told her entire life that being chosen was the highest honor a girl could receive, that it meant you were strong enough and special enough to protect the whole family. Jessica's mother placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, pride and sadness mixing on her face. In that moment, watching Jessica's innocent smile, something inside me snapped. I stood up from my chair, my legs shaking but my hands steady as I pulled out my phone and pressed play on the prepared audio file. 8 months of recordings began pouring through hidden speakers that I had carefully placed around the dining room the previous night. Tiny Bluetooth speakers tucked behind picture frames and underside tables, positioned strategically so the sound would fill the entire space. The dining room erupted into complete chaos within seconds. Christina's voice filled the space, begging for mercy, screaming in pain, crying for someone to help her. My uncle's voice instructing his teenage son on proper technique. My father's voice, cold and angry, blaming Christina for his work stress. My grandfather's voice, the worst of all, explaining his philosophy about the humanitarian solution while the sound of his belt hitting flesh punctuated his words. Family members started screaming at me from all directions, lunging toward where I stood, trying to reach my phone, trying to stop the speakers. My father grabbed for me, but I stepped back. My uncle overturned his chair in his rush to get to me. But while they were focused entirely on stopping me and destroying my phone and shutting down those speakers, Amanda had already slipped away to the bathroom and called emergency services on her cell phone, giving our address and calmly explaining that multiple people were being held against their will and that there was immediate danger. The other girls formed a protective circle around me as evidence poured through those speakers like water breaking through a dam, filling the room with undeniable proof of what had been happening in that basement for decades. Audio recordings of beatings and crying and begging for mercy played for 12 straight minutes, the maximum I could fit into the file. Photographs appeared on the television screen, which I had connected to my laptop that morning while pretending to help set up. Images of the room and its restraints, the chains mounted into concrete walls, the mattress stained with blood and other substances, the slot in the door where meals were delivered. Documentation appeared on screen going back 42 years that we had copied from my grandmother's notebooks, her meticulous records of which girl served when, her performance ratings, her notes about each girl's breaking point. The newer generations had no idea how long this had been going on, and I watched shock register on faces of cousins and in-laws who had never known the full scope. My family could not believe, could not comprehend, that I would betray what they called the humanitarian solution so publicly that I would destroy our family's privacy this way. Even as police officers came through the front door and began leading family members away in handcuffs, even as officers read them their rights, they kept insisting that the system prevented much worse violence from occurring, that I had just condemned the whole family to chaos and uncontrolled rage. My grandmother kept repeating the same thing over and over like a broken record, saying we were protecting the family, that one sacrifice saved so many others. But they had been so confident in their tradition for so long, so absolutely certain of their righteousness and the necessity of their system, that they never imagined anyone would actually defy it, or that their perfect arrangement could be disrupted. They fought the charges until the very end, hiring expensive lawyers from the city, claiming religious freedom protections, insisting that the chosen girls volunteered for their roles willingly. The initial arrests happened quickly and quietly on that Christmas evening. 19 family members were charged with various crimes. That was when I truly began to understand just how deeply disturbed our family tradition really was, how much psychological damage had been normalized across generations. My family hired the most expensive defense lawyers that money could buy, attorneys from a prestigious firm in Boston. 4 weeks after the arrests, we found ourselves in a county courthouse for the preliminary hearing. The judge carefully reviewed every piece of evidence we had collected. Then he looked up with completely dead, expressionless eyes and said the two words that made my heart stop: "Case dismissed." I saw it in that moment. Noticed the scar on his wrist, the same distinctive mark that all the men in my family wore, a thin line that they claimed came from a shared accident, but that I now understood meant something else entirely. The scar caught the fluorescent courtroom lights as Judge Patterson gathered his papers and folders together. My hands started shaking uncontrollably as I watched him stand, watched my family members embrace their lawyers with relief flooding across their faces like water breaking through a dam. Christina swayed on her feet in the witness chair where she had been testifying, her medical records scattered across the prosecutor's table like discarded newspapers. I grabbed the prosecutor's arm as he packed his briefcase, desperate for some explanation of what had just happened. He yanked his arm away without meeting my eyes, muttering something about jurisdictional issues and procedural problems. The bailiff ushered us toward the exit while my grandmother smiled triumphantly from across the courtroom, her expression one of absolute vindication. My father clapped my uncle's shoulder, both men already pulling out their cell phones to share the good news with family members who hadn't been able to attend the hearing. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered around my family's legal team, cameras and microphones thrust forward. I heard fragments of their prepared statement about false accusations made by troubled youth seeking attention, about the importance of family privacy, about religious persecution. My younger cousins huddled close to me on the courthouse steps. Jessica's small hand gripped mine so tightly that her nails left little crescent marks in my palm. Amanda kept glancing back at the courthouse doors like she expected police officers to suddenly burst through and fix this impossible reversal of justice. 4 hours later, my phone started buzzing with photographs from my aunt's social media accounts. My entire family was celebrating at Giovanni's, their favorite Italian restaurant in the downtown area. Champagne glasses were raised in the air. My grandfather's arm was draped around Judge Patterson's shoulders in a photograph that made my stomach turn. The judge's silver bracelet glinted in the camera flash next to my grandfather's matching one. The caption read, "Justice prevails. Family stays strong together." Christina collapsed in my apartment bathroom that night around 9 o'clock. The paramedics who responded to my emergency call said her blood pressure had spiked to dangerously high levels, that her body was responding to the extreme stress of testifying and then watching the case dismissed. As they loaded her onto the stretcher, she kept whispering about going back to the room, about how they would make her pay severely for daring to speak up against the family. I rode with her in the ambulance to County Medical Center, holding her hand while she drifted in and out of consciousness. The next morning brought 29 missed calls from unknown phone numbers. The first voicemail was just breathing, heavy and deliberate. The second message contained whispers about keeping family business private where it belonged. By the seventh message, the voice was clearly stating that some girls never learned their lessons and that there were consequences for betrayal. I changed my phone number that same afternoon, though I wondered how much good it would actually do. 3 days passed in a blur of hospital visits and locked apartment doors and looking over my shoulder constantly. Christina stabilized but refused to eat anything, convinced that someone would poison her food if she let her guard down. The younger cousin's parents had already started pulling them out of school, claiming sudden family emergencies or deciding to homeschool for personal reasons. Amanda's mother showed up at my apartment building, pounding on my door and demanding that I stop filling her daughter's head with lies and poisonous ideas about the family. The package arrived on the 4th morning, left outside my apartment door. There was no return address, just my name printed in block letters. Inside, photocopied bank statements spilled across my kitchen table when I opened the envelope. Monthly transfers from my grandfather's business account, Patterson Financial Consulting, LLC, going back 17 years. Always the same amount on the same day, the first of each month without fail. Beneath the financial statements were photographs that made everything click into place. Judge Patterson at my cousin Sarah's baptism 8 years ago, wearing the ceremonial silver bracelet reserved for family members. Judge Patterson at my grandfather's 75th birthday party, standing among the men who carried keys to the basement. Judge Patterson's signature on court documents dismissing 4 other cases that my family had faced over the years. Cases I had never even heard about until I saw those papers. I drove straight to the district attorney's office, my heart pounding the entire way. The secretary looked up from her desk when I walked in, her fingers pausing over her computer keyboard. When I explained why I needed to see the district attorney urgently, that I had evidence of judicial corruption and bribery, she smiled apologetically and said he was out of town indefinitely on a family emergency. As she reached for her appointment book to see when he might return, her sleeve rode up her arm. A thin silver chain circled her wrist, delicate but completely unmistakable in design. I backed out of the office slowly, clutching my envelope of evidence against my chest like a shield. In the parking lot, my hands shook so badly that I couldn't get my key into the car door lock. A security guard approached, asking if I needed assistance, his expression seemingly concerned and genuine. Right up until I noticed the silver tie clip shaped like our family crest pinned to his uniform. That night, every single window in my apartment shattered while I was at my waitressing job. My neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, called my cell phone to report the break-in, her voice trembling as she described the glass covering my living room floor like deadly snow. The police officer who responded to her call told her nothing appeared to be stolen, which made it even more frightening somehow. But someone had left something behind, a photograph placed carefully on my coffee table where I would be sure to see it. Christina in her hospital bed, photographed from outside her room window on the 3rd floor. Jessica called that same evening, sobbing so hard I could barely understand what she was trying to tell me. Her parents were sending her to live with our grandparents permanently, effective immediately. They said she needed discipline and structure, that she needed to understand her proper place in the family hierarchy. She begged me to help her, to do something, but the phone line went dead before I could respond with anything useful. When I called the number back repeatedly, I got a message saying it had been disconnected. Amanda's family moved her across state lines within 48 hours. Her last text message to me simply said they were transferring her father's job immediately and that she had to go. No forwarding address, no way to contact her, no goodbyes. The other cousins who had helped me collect evidence went silent one by one over the following week. Their social media accounts were deactivated. Their phone numbers were disconnected. It was like they had been erased from existence. My bank called about suspicious activity on my accounts. Someone had reported potential fraud, which triggered an automatic freeze on all my assets while they investigated. The process would take several weeks minimum, they explained, apologizing for the inconvenience but saying their hands were tied by federal regulations. My credit card stopped working that same afternoon when I tried to buy groceries. Work became impossible when my supervisor called me into her office for an unexpected meeting. Anonymous complaints had been flooding the restaurant's inbox about my performance, my attitude toward customers, my reliability. The accusations were vague, but numerous enough to warrant suspension pending a full investigation into my conduct. My supervisor seemed embarrassed about the whole situation, but insisted that protocol had to be followed, that her hands were tied. With no money coming in and no job and mounting bills, I called my friend Rachel, someone I had known since we were in community college together. She had always said her door was open if I ever needed anything. Her father, David, answered when I knocked on their door that evening. He was a solid man in his early 60s with sharp, observant eyes who listened to my rushed, panicked explanation without interrupting once. He guided me inside where Rachel wrapped me in a fierce hug that made me start crying for the first time since the trial. David Martinez had worked as a private investigator for 33 years before retiring 5 years ago. He poured coffee while I spread all my evidence across his dining room table, his expression growing progressively darker with each document he examined. When I finished explaining everything, he pulled out a yellow legal pad and began making detailed notes, asking specific questions about dates and names and connections. "This is not the first time I have seen something like this," he said quietly, though never this organized or this extensive, but the patterns are familiar to me from other cases. He disappeared into his home office and returned with several boxes of old case files, papers he had kept from his decades of investigative work. Together, we spent hours cross-referencing names and dates, building a web of connections on his dining room wall using string and pushpins. Judge Patterson's name appeared repeatedly in David's old files, always dismissing cases that involved prominent families, always with sealed records that mentioned basement rooms or unexplained injuries to young women. Over the next 2 weeks, David made careful inquiries through his remaining contacts in law enforcement, people he had worked with over the years who still trusted him. 14 similar cases over the past 23 years, all dismissed by Judge Patterson or by other judges connected to him through various professional and social organizations. Each family involved had unexplained wealth that seemed disproportionate to their stated incomes. Each family had young women who disappeared from public view around age 18. Each family owned properties with unusual modifications that raised questions during tax assessments. "We need more than paper trails and financial records," David explained to me one evening over dinner. "We need the women who survived these situations to come forward and tell their stories." Using his investigative skills and old contacts, David managed to track down 4 women from the dismissed cases he had found. Michelle Thompson, now 35 years old, who had escaped her family at age 21. Laura Garcia, 30 years old, who had testified about a locked room in her uncle's house when she was 19. Jennifer Kim, 43 years old, who tried to report her family's tradition when she was just 18. And Diana Russo, 27, who had run away and changed her identity. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop in a town about 40 miles away from where any of our families lived. The women entered separately over the course of 15 minutes, each one scanning the room with the kind of hypervigilance that I recognized in myself. Michelle spoke first, her voice steady and clear as she described her family's discipline room, using almost the exact same terminology my family used. Laura showed us faded scars on her ankles from years of wearing restraints. Jennifer pulled out photographs from an old shoebox, pictures of other girls who had not survived their family's traditions, their deaths explained away as accidents or runaways. Diana's hands trembled as she held her coffee cup, but her voice never wavered. "They all protect each other," Jennifer explained, her eyes meeting each of ours. "The judges, the police officers, the business owners, the lawyers. They marry between families and bind themselves together with shared secrets. It is like a network that spans across multiple states. Each woman had evidence they had been collecting and hiding for years. Photographs, documents, medical records that sympathetic doctors had secretly copied, recordings made on old cassette tapes or digital files. More importantly, they had names and addresses. 17 families across 5 different states, all connected through marriages and business partnerships, all maintaining their own versions of the tradition with slight variations. The silver markings identified members of this network, worn as jewelry by some and scarred into skin by others who took their commitment more seriously. David compiled all our evidence into a comprehensive report that took him 3 days of steady work. Federal crimes because they cross state lines, he explained to all of us. Kidnapping, false imprisonment, conspiracy to commit violence, obstruction of justice. The federal courthouse operates completely outside local jurisdiction, which means we can bypass Judge Patterson and his entire network. The 5 women created detailed affidavits while David prepared the filing, each one taking hours spread across multiple days to document years of abuse, naming specific individuals with their full names, providing exact dates and locations. Michelle's hands trembled as she signed her statement, but her jaw was set with determination that reminded me of my own resolve. She had survived 8 years in her family's room before finally escaping during a house fire that her brother had started accidentally. That fire had been her salvation, the chaos allowing her to break free when everyone was distracted. Laura cried softly while writing her statement, tears falling onto the pages and smudging the ink. But she never stopped writing, never gave up. She told me later that every tear represented a girl who had not survived, who had not been able to tell her story. Jennifer's affidavit was 23 pages long, single-spaced, with an additional 47 pages of supporting documentation she had collected over 25 years. She had been planning to come forward for decades, but had been too afraid until she saw our case making headlines. Diana's statement was the shortest at only 8 pages, but somehow the most devastating in its stark simplicity. her words stripped down to bare facts that hit like physical blows. She wrote in simple declarative sentences that left no room for interpretation or excuse, and when she finished, she said she felt lighter than she had in 10 years. David worked 16-hour days compiling everything into a format that federal prosecutors could use effectively. He organized the evidence chronologically, by family, by type of abuse, by connections between families. He created charts showing financial transactions, family trees mapping marriages between the network families, timelines showing how long each woman had been held. His dining room transformed into a war room with papers covering every surface, strings connecting photographs and documents on the walls, highlighters in 6 different colors marking different categories of evidence. Rachel brought us food and coffee, understanding that we were racing against time, that Jessica's ceremony was scheduled and that other girls might be in danger. 3 weeks before our federal hearing date was scheduled, my grandmother appeared at Rachel's front door at 8 in the morning on a Tuesday. David answered, positioning his body between her and the interior of the house, his stance protective but not aggressive. She smiled warmly like she was just a concerned grandmother coming to visit, her expression so convincing that for a moment I almost forgot everything she had done. She was wearing her church clothes, a floral dress with a pearl necklace, looking like somebody's sweet grandma who baked cookies and knitted scarves. She claimed she wanted to reconcile with me, that families should not be divided over misunderstandings and different perspectives. Her voice was honey-sweet, dripping with false warmth and manufactured concern. When David did not move or invite her inside, when he simply stood there like a stone wall, her smile began to flicker at the edges. She pulled out a manila envelope from her expensive leather purse, the kind that cost more than I made in 3 months at the restaurant. $2.5 million, she announced loudly, projecting her voice so I would hear from wherever I was in the house. A trust fund for my granddaughter if she reconsiders this foolish path she is currently on, if she remembers where her loyalties should lie. I stepped into the doorway so she could see me directly, meeting her cold blue eyes with my own. For just a moment, I saw something flicker across her face. Maybe a hope that I would actually accept, that money would solve everything. The warm grandmother act evaporated instantly when she saw my expression, her face twisting with disgust and rage that she could no longer hide. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, the envelope crinkling in her grip. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a hiss that was barely audible but carried the weight of decades of cruelty. "You stupid, ungrateful girl," she said, each word enunciated clearly. "After everything we gave you, after we raised you and fed you and put a roof over your head. The tradition continues with or without your cooperation, with or without your approval. We have already selected Jessica as Christina's replacement because she helped you betray us. The ceremony is scheduled for next Sunday afternoon at 3 o'clock, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop it." Her smile returned, triumphant and cruel. "We thought you might try something, so we moved it up. By the time your federal friends finish their paperwork, Jessica will already be wearing the anklet." My blood turned to absolute ice in my veins. Jessica was only 13 years old now, the same age as my cousin Maya had been during the trial. But Jessica had helped me, had participated in exposing the family, which made her a target for punishment. I lunged forward instinctively, but David caught my arm, holding me back firmly as my grandmother walked calmly to her car and drove away. "We need a strategic plan," David said firmly once we were back inside. "If we act rashly or emotionally, we lose everything we have built." But I could not wait another week, could not let Jessica go through what Christina had endured. That night, I drove to my grandparents' house alone, parking 2 blocks away and walking through the shadows. The basement window glowed with that familiar faint light I remembered from childhood. Using lock-picking skills that Amanda had taught me before she disappeared, I worked the lock on the cellar door until it clicked open. The metal was cold against my trembling fingers, and I had to try 3 different picks before I found the right combination that would release the mechanism. Amanda had made me practice for hours on old locks she bought at yard sales, telling me that one day these skills might save someone's life, though neither of us had imagined it would be Jessica's life I was trying to save. The lock finally gave way with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night, and I eased the door open, wincing at every tiny creak of the hinges. My heart was pounding so hard I thought the sound alone might alert someone inside the house, but I forced myself to move forward, to descend into that basement one more time. The familiar smell of damp concrete and fear filled my nostrils as I descended those stairs I had walked down so many times as a child. Jessica sat in the corner of the soundproof room, a silver anklet already locked around her thin ankle. She looked up at me with hollow eyes, already beginning the dissociation process that Christina had perfected over her years of service. I rushed to her, kneeling beside her and examining the lock while she whispered about the ceremony she had gone through the previous evening, about how our grandmother had told her it was an honor and that she should be proud. Footsteps echoed overhead suddenly, multiple sets, moving with purpose and deliberation. The ceremony was supposed to be later in the week, but they were starting early, probably suspecting I might try something. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands, starting a live stream on social media as I worked frantically on the lock. The lock picks kept slipping in my sweaty hands while voices grew louder and closer above us. The basement door swung open just as the anklet finally clicked free from Jessica's leg. My father descended the stairs first, followed by my uncles and grandfather and several male cousins I had not seen in months. They stopped short when they saw me crouched beside Jessica, my phone held up and pointing at them. "Thousands of people are watching right now," I said loudly. "They can see everything you do." My uncle rushed forward aggressively. I tried to dodge, but more family members poured down those stairs, filling the small space. Someone grabbed my wrist hard, trying to wrestle the phone away from me. Jessica screamed as my aunt reached for her with grasping hands. The room erupted into complete chaos with bodies pushing and shoving in the confined space. Car doors slammed outside, multiple vehicles. David's voice boomed from the top of the stairs, deep and commanding, accompanied by other unfamiliar voices announcing themselves as federal marshals. The family members froze like statues as agents in tactical gear flooded the basement, weapons drawn but not yet aimed at anyone. "We have been monitoring this live stream," the lead marshal announced in a calm voice. "Everyone needs to remain exactly where you are." The arrests happened efficiently this time, no confusion or delays. Federal agents documented every inch of the room, photographed the ankle restraints and the chains mounted to the walls, bagged evidence with practiced precision. They had been building their own case since our federal filing, David explained to me later at the hospital where they took Jessica and me for evaluation. My livestream provided the probable cause they needed for immediate intervention without waiting for our scheduled hearing. The federal trial began 7 months later in a courthouse 2 states away. Without local interference or corrupt judges, the full scope of the network finally emerged. 17 families maintaining abuse traditions for generations, protected by 11 judges and officials throughout multiple justice systems. Each family contributed monthly to a shared fund that paid for legal protection and enforced silence. Judge Patterson's arrest made national headlines when investigators found detailed financial records in his home safe along with a membership list. 4 other judges fell with him, along with 3 police chiefs and numerous city and county officials. They all bore the silver markings in one form or another. All had participated in protecting the network for years or even decades. My immediate family received sentences ranging from 22 years to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. My grandfather would die in prison. The judge made that clear, as would my father. My grandmother, who had selected victims for more than 40 years, received 43 years. The other families faced similar fates as more survivors came forward, emboldened by our success and the national media attention. The trial was covered by major news networks and became a symbol of multi-generational abuse finally being exposed. Christina spent 9 months in intensive therapy, slowly and painfully reclaiming pieces of herself that had been destroyed during her years in that room. The younger cousins were placed with carefully vetted foster families in different states, families who had been trained to understand trauma and complex PTSD. Jessica lived with a family 3 states away, but we video called every single week, and I watched her slowly learn to smile again, to trust again, to believe that the world could be safe. I returned to school to finish my degree in social work, focusing specifically on family trauma and cult dynamics, determined to help other survivors. My desk at my internship displayed one photograph that I looked at every single day. Jessica and me standing outside the federal courthouse on the day we both testified, both of us finally free from the silver anklets that once marked us as future victims or current ones. The family house was seized during asset forfeiture proceedings. Federal investigators spent 3 weeks examining every inch of the property with ground-penetrating radar and structural engineers. In a sub-basement behind a false wall that my grandfather had constructed, they found human remains. 9 women dating back to 1968, the ones who had not survived their selection periods. Their families had been told they had run away or eloped or moved away for opportunities. Letters still arrived monthly from various prisons around the country. My relatives called me traitor, destroyer, ungrateful child, family betrayer. I kept every single letter filed neatly in a box I labeled evidence of no remorse. They served as reminders that breaking the silence had not just saved Jessica and Christina, it had saved generations of girls who would never know that soundproof room existed, who would never wear those silver anklets. David helped me understand that true courage meant facing systems that were larger than yourself, systems that seemed invincible. The network had seemed untouchable, protected by wealth and power and tradition and fear. But evidence combined with persistence and federal law had brought them down completely. Every family's secret room now stood empty, preserved as evidence, their traditions finally and permanently broken. My phone rang constantly with calls from survivors in other states, women who had seen the trial coverage and recognized their own family's patterns in what was described. I guided them to resources, connected them with attorneys who would not be bought or intimidated, helped them understand that speaking up was possible. The network had been vast and well-organized and powerful, but the community of survivors rising to dismantle it was growing larger and stronger every single day. Some nights, I still heard echoes of Christina's cries through imagined vents, still woke up in a panic thinking I was back in that house. But then I would remember Jessica's laugh during our last video call, or I would see another survivor's testimony bringing down another family's tradition in another state, and I knew that everything had been worth it. The rooms were empty now across 5 states. The silver anklets had been melted down and cataloged as evidence. The cycle had been broken by women and girls who refused to let it continue, who found their voices when the system tried to silence them, who stood together when they were supposed to stand alone. And every single day, I woke up grateful that I had found the courage to record those sounds through the vents, to play them at Christmas dinner, to refuse to let one more girl be chosen, to break a tradition that should never have existed in the first place. The weeks following the federal arrests became a blur of interviews with investigators, meetings with prosecutors, and therapy sessions that barely scratched the surface of the trauma we had all experienced. Christina remained hospitalized for another month, her physical injuries healing faster than the psychological ones. The doctors said she had developed complex post-traumatic stress disorder, that her mind had created elaborate coping mechanisms just to survive each day in that room. She flinched at sudden movements and could not tolerate being in enclosed spaces without having panic attacks that left her gasping for air on the floor. The therapist explained that recovery would take years, possibly decades, that some parts of her might never fully heal. I visited her every single day when they finally allowed visitors beyond immediate family, bringing books and magazines and just sitting with her in silence when she could not talk about what she had been through. The younger cousins were adjusting to their new lives in foster care with varying degrees of success. Jessica's foster family sent me weekly updates with photos of her learning to ride a bike, something she had never been allowed to do before because my grandmother said it was too dangerous for girls who might be selected. In one photo, Jessica was grinning with 2 front teeth missing, looking like a normal 13-year-old for the first time in her life. Her foster mother wrote that Jessica still had nightmares every night, but that they were becoming less frequent, that she was slowly learning to trust that she was truly safe. Sophia was placed with a family in Oregon who specialized in trauma recovery, former social workers who had fostered dozens of children from difficult situations. She was learning to paint and had started writing poetry about her experiences. Her therapist said this creative expression was helping her process everything she had witnessed and endured. Amanda ended up with a family in Colorado, and although she struggled with anger management issues and had gotten into several fights at her new school, she was also excelling in her robotics class and had joined a rock climbing gym where she said the physical challenge helped her feel more in control of her body. The trial preparation consumed my entire life for months. David worked tirelessly, often sleeping only 3 or 4 hours a night, driven by a sense of purpose he said he had not felt since his early days as a private investigator. He explained to me one evening over cold pizza that cases like this were why he had gotten into investigative work in the first place, because he believed in exposing systems of power that protected abusers. His wife had left him years ago because of his obsession with his work, he told me, but he had no regrets because he knew the work mattered. Rachel supported both of us, making sure we ate real meals at least once a day, forcing us to take breaks when we had been staring at documents for 8 hours straight, reminding us that we could not help anyone if we burned ourselves out completely. The other survivor women became my closest support system, the only people who truly understood what we were fighting against. Michelle called me almost every night, sometimes just to talk about normal things like movies or recipes, other times to share memories of her own experiences that she had never told anyone before. She said that preparing her testimony was bringing up things she had buried for years, memories she had convinced herself were not real, or not that bad. Laura and I met for coffee every week at a diner halfway between where we each lived, spending hours talking about our families, about the mechanisms of control and manipulation they had used, about how we were supposed to move forward with our lives after everything. Jennifer had become something of a mentor to all of us, the oldest survivor who had been fighting this battle the longest. She had spent 25 years collecting evidence and trying to find someone who would listen, someone who would believe her and take action. She told us that seeing our case finally moving forward gave her hope that her decades of work had not been wasted, that the evidence she had preserved might finally be used to help other survivors. The federal prosecutors were methodical and thorough in a way that local law enforcement had never been. Special Agent Morrison, who led the investigation, spent weeks interviewing each of us separately, verifying every detail of our statements, cross-referencing our accounts to build an airtight case. She explained that federal cases moved slowly because they had to be absolutely perfect, that defense attorneys for wealthy families would exploit any tiny inconsistency or procedural error. She had short gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see right through any attempt at deflection, but her voice was always gentle when she asked us to relive traumatic memories. She told me privately that in her 22 years with the FBI, she had never seen a network this organized or this extensive, that most abuse cases involved single families acting alone. This conspiracy crossed state lines, involved multiple judges and law enforcement officials, and had been operating successfully for more than 50 years. The scope of it was unprecedented in her experience. As the investigation expanded, more families were identified and more survivors came forward. A woman in Texas contacted the FBI after seeing news coverage of our case, explaining that her family had a similar tradition but called it something different. A man in Ohio reached out to say that his sisters had been victims of their family's system and that he had been trying to report it for years without success. Each new survivor added pieces to the puzzle, showing how the network had spread through marriages and business partnerships, how families had shared strategies for avoiding detection and dealing with troublesome family members who questioned the traditions. The prosecutors estimated that across 5 states, more than 30 families had been involved to varying degrees, protecting each other through shared secrets and financial incentives. The network operated like a corporation in some ways, David explained to me while showing me organizational charts he had created. There were inner circle families who had been involved since the beginning, founding members like my grandfather who had established the original framework back in the 1960s. Then there were outer circle families who had been brought in later through marriages or business connections, families who participated but had less power in decision-making. The judges and law enforcement officials received monthly payments through various shell companies and consulting firms, making the money trail difficult but not impossible to follow. They also received other benefits like business opportunities, political support, and access to exclusive social networks. It was not just about the abuse itself, but about creating a system of mutual obligation and shared guilt that made exposure impossible for any single person. My grandmother's notebooks, which federal investigators seized from her house, contained details that went far beyond what I had been able to copy. She had kept records of every girl who had served since 1967, including 8 who had died while in service. The causes of death listed in her careful handwriting ranged from untreated infections to internal injuries to what she called emotional failure, which I understood to mean suicide. She had rated each girl's performance on various metrics, noting which ones lasted longest, which ones required the most discipline, which ones adapted best to their roles. Reading these notebooks made me physically ill. Seeing my Aunt Rebecca's name, seeing the names of cousins and extended family members I had never known existed. Some entries were matter-of-fact and clinical. Others revealed a disturbing pride in the system she had helped maintain for decades. She wrote about refining techniques over the years, about learning which girls made the best subjects, about how to identify potential problems early. It read like a manual for systematic torture, and prosecutors told me it would be some of the most damning evidence at trial. The families hired a coordinated legal defense team, pooling resources to afford the most expensive lawyers they could find. The defense strategy became clear during preliminary hearings. They would argue that the women had participated voluntarily as part of religious and cultural traditions protected under the First Amendment. They would claim that the recordings had been obtained illegally, that the evidence was circumstantial, that this was simply a case of young people misunderstanding their families' customs. Their lawyers gave press conferences talking about religious freedom and government overreach, painting the families as victims of an overzealous federal investigation. Some conservative media outlets picked up this narrative, running stories about traditional families being persecuted for their beliefs. This made me furious, watching people defend systematic abuse as culture or religion. But the prosecutors assured me that judges and juries would see through these arguments when presented with the full evidence. My own mental health deteriorated as the trial date approached. I stopped sleeping more than 3 or 4 hours a night, plagued by nightmares where I was the one selected for the basement, or where I failed to save Jessica in time. I lost 20 pounds because food tasted like ash in my mouth, my body rejecting nourishment when my mind was consumed by stress. Rachel insisted I see a therapist, someone who specialized in trauma, and although I resisted at first, I eventually agreed. Dr. Chen was a quiet woman in her 50s who had worked with cult survivors and people who had escaped from high-control groups. She helped me understand that what I was experiencing was normal, that my body and mind were processing years of fear and psychological manipulation. She taught me grounding techniques for when panic attacks hit, ways to bring myself back to the present moment when flashbacks threatened to overwhelm me. She also helped me work through the complicated guilt I felt about not doing something sooner, about the years Christina spent in that room while I was collecting evidence. The betrayal by extended family members cut deeper than I expected. Cousins I had played with as a child, aunts who had attended my birthday parties, uncles who had taught me to ride a bike, they all testified for the defense. They told the grand jury that I was a troubled teenager who had always been dramatic, that I fabricated everything for attention, that the recordings were fake or taken out of context. My favorite aunt, the one who used to sneak me candy and let me stay up late watching movies when I visited her house, gave an interview to a local news station calling me a liar and a family destroyer. She said I had always been jealous of the girls who were chosen, that I was angry about not being selected myself. This revisionist history, this complete denial of reality, was almost harder to bear than the original abuse. It meant they really believed in the system, really thought it was right and necessary. They were not just going along with it out of fear. Christina's testimony during the trial was the most difficult thing I have ever witnessed. She had to describe in detail what had been done to her over 3.5 years, had to identify family members in the courtroom and explain which acts each person had committed. The defense attorneys tried to break her down during cross-examination, suggesting she had mental health issues that made her unreliable, implying she had somehow consented to her treatment, asking why she never tried to escape if it was really so bad. She answered every question with a steady voice that occasionally broke but never stopped, maintaining her composure even when they showed her photographs of her own injuries and suggested she had inflicted them on herself. When asked why she never told anyone outside the family, she looked directly at the jury and said, "Because I was told from the time I was 8 years old that I would be killed if I ever spoke about it. Because I watched what happened to girls who resisted. Because every single authority figure in my life told me this was normal and necessary." Her testimony lasted 6 hours over 2 days, and by the end, several jurors were crying openly, The physical evidence was overwhelming and impossible to dismiss. Forensic teams had examined the basement room and found DNA evidence from multiple victims. The soundproofing itself was elaborate and expensive, clearly designed for a specific purpose. The restraints mounted to the walls showed years of wear and had been modified multiple times to accommodate different body sizes. The slot in the door where meals were delivered had smooth edges from decades of use. Medical experts testified about Christina's injuries, explaining that the pattern of damage could only have resulted from repeated systematic abuse over an extended period. The lock on the silver anklet required a special key that only certain family members possessed. Keys that were found in my father's sock drawer, my grandfather's desk, my uncle's wallet. The prosecution presented it all methodically, piece by piece, building a case that left no room for reasonable doubt. Judge Patterson's corruption trial happened separately, but overlapped with our main case. Federal investigators had found similar arrangements with 4 other judges across 3 states, creating a network of corrupt officials who protected multiple families engaged in systematic abuse. The payments totaled millions of dollars over 2 decades, routed through shell companies and consulting fees. Patterson had dismissed 13 cases that should have resulted in investigations and arrests, had sealed records that should have been public, had violated judicial ethics in ways that shocked even experienced prosecutors. His own family had been involved in the network. His wife came from one of the founding families. His children had grown up understanding the traditions. When he finally testified, hoping for a reduced sentence, he described a culture where these practices were normalized from childhood, where participating was expected if you wanted to maintain family and business connections. He showed no remorse for the girls who had suffered because of his corruption, only regret that he had been caught. The day the verdict came in, I sat in the courtroom surrounded by the other survivors. We had all testified, had all relived our trauma in public, had all been accused of lying and attention-seeking. The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 3 days. When they filed back into the courtroom, I could not read their expressions. The foreman stood and read verdict after verdict, guilty on all counts for each of the 19 family members charged in federal court. The courtroom erupted, some people cheering, others crying, my grandmother screaming that this was an injustice and that we would all burn in hell. The judge had to bang his gavel repeatedly to restore order. My family members were led away in handcuffs, still protesting, still insisting they had done nothing wrong. My grandfather, age 87, received life in prison without possibility of parole. My father, age 53, received 45 years. My grandmother, age 82, received 43 years. The sentences continued, decades of prison time for decades of abuse. Christina held my hand during the sentencing hearing, squeezing so tight I thought she might break my fingers. We listened to victim impact statements from 9 survivors, each one describing how the abuse had destroyed their lives, stolen their childhoods, left them with trauma they would carry forever. I gave my own statement, explaining that I had nightmares every night about not acting sooner, about the girls who did not survive, about Jessica almost being selected. I looked directly at my grandmother as I spoke, and she looked away, the first time I had ever seen her back down from eye contact. The judge called the abuse horrific and unprecedented, said the sentences needed to send a message that wealth and family tradition could not protect people from justice. He noted that the defendants showed no remorse, no understanding of the damage they had caused, which made them dangerous even in their advanced ages. The aftermath of the trial was both liberating and exhausting. Media coverage was intense and often intrusive. Reporters camping outside my apartment building, calling my phone constantly, trying to get exclusive interviews. I gave one carefully prepared statement and then refused all other requests, wanting to move forward rather than becoming defined by this trauma forever. Some coverage was sympathetic and helpful, bringing attention to similar cases and encouraging other survivors to come forward. Other coverage was sensationalized and harmful, treating our pain as entertainment, speculating about details that were nobody's business. I learned to stop reading articles about the case, to protect my own mental health by limiting my exposure to public commentary. Christina moved across the country to live with her aunt, one of the few family members who had not been involved in the network. She sent me letters every few weeks, updating me on her progress in therapy, telling me about her attempts to build a normal life. She got a job at a bookstore and started taking online classes, working toward a degree in psychology because she wanted to help other survivors someday. Her letters were always hopeful but tinged with sadness, acknowledging that recovery was not linear and that some days were harder than others. She wrote that she still could not sleep in complete darkness, that she kept multiple nightlights in every room, that the sound of doors locking made her heart race. But she also wrote about moments of joy, about reading a book that made her laugh, about making a friend at work who knew nothing about her past, about feeling the sun on her face and remembering that she was free. Jessica thrived in her foster home in ways that brought tears to my eyes during our video calls. She joined the soccer team at her new school and discovered she was fast and competitive. She made friends easily once she learned that she did not have to be afraid of forming attachments. Her foster parents sent her to a trauma therapist who specialized in working with children, using play therapy and art therapy to help her process what she had experienced. Jessica started calling me every Sunday evening, our standing appointment to talk about her week. She told me about her classes, her friends, the soccer games she played. She asked me questions about normal family life, about whether it was okay to disagree with your parents, about whether families were supposed to have locked rooms. Her innocence had been damaged but not destroyed, and watching her heal gave me hope that children could recover from even the worst circumstances if given proper support and safety. I eventually went back to school, enrolling in a social work program at the state university. The financial stress was significant, especially after losing my job and having my accounts frozen, but I qualified for scholarships and grants for survivors of family violence. My professors were understanding about my situation, offering extensions when I needed them, connecting me with resources for students dealing with trauma. I threw myself into my studies, determined to transform my experiences into something that could help others. I specialized in family violence, cult dynamics, and high-control group recovery. My senior thesis examined how networks of abuse operate and how to identify them before they cause generational damage. One professor told me it was the most comprehensive undergraduate research she had seen in 15 years of teaching. David became like a father figure to me, filling the void left by my biological father's imprisonment. He taught me practical skills like basic home repair and self-defense, but more importantly, he taught me how to trust again, how to let people help me without expecting ulterior motives. His house became my refuge when my apartment felt too empty, or when nightmares made it impossible to stay in bed. Rachel and I grew closer, becoming the sisters we both wished we had during childhood. We developed our own traditions, simple things like Friday movie nights and Sunday morning breakfast, creating the kind of healthy family rituals I had never experienced growing up. They attended my graduation when I finished my bachelor's degree, cheering louder than anyone else in the auditorium, David holding a sign that said, "We are proud of you," written in bright red letters. The younger cousins stayed in touch as much as they could, forming a survivors support network that met monthly via video call. We shared our struggles and victories, offering advice and encouragement to each other. Sophia was excelling in art school, creating powerful pieces that dealt with themes of captivity and freedom. Amanda had channeled her anger into advocacy work, speaking at high schools about recognizing signs of family abuse. The group provided accountability and connection, reminding us that we were not alone in our recovery. Some months the calls were heavy with grief and setbacks. Other months they were filled with laughter and celebration of small victories. We created a private online forum where we could post anytime we needed support, sharing resources, articles about trauma recovery, memes that only survivors would find funny. This community became essential to all of us, a chosen family built on understanding and mutual support. Years passed, and life gradually began to feel less heavy. I got my master's degree in social work and started working at a nonprofit that supported survivors of family violence and cult abuse. My office was small but comfortable, decorated with artwork from survivors, including a painting Sophia had made specifically for me. I facilitated support groups, helped survivors navigate legal systems, connected people with therapists who understood complex trauma. The work was emotionally demanding, often triggering my own memories and trauma responses, but it also felt meaningful in a way nothing else had. I was using my experiences to help others, transforming pain into purpose, exactly as my therapist had suggested years earlier. Christina eventually moved back to our state, ready to face her past and determined to continue her advocacy work locally. We met for lunch at a quiet cafe, our first in-person meeting in 4 years. She looked different, healthier, with color in her cheeks and strength in her posture. She had cut her hair short and wore bright colors instead of the muted tones she used to prefer. We talked for 3 hours, catching up on years of life, processing our experiences from the perspective of time and healing. She told me she was writing a book about her experiences, hoping to help other survivors understand they were not alone and that recovery was possible. I told her about my work, about the families I was helping, about how our case had inspired changes in how federal authorities investigated networked abuse. We cried together and laughed together, two survivors who had both lost so much but had somehow found ways to keep living. The houses where the abuse occurred were eventually demolished. My grandparents' house, along with 3 others owned by families in the network, were torn down after the government seized them through asset forfeiture. I watched from a distance as the wrecking ball swung through the walls of the house where I had grown up, where so many girls had suffered. It felt symbolic, a physical representation of the system being destroyed. The basement where Christina and the others had been held was filled with concrete before demolition, ensuring that space could never be used again. New houses would eventually be built on those lots, homes for families who would never know the darkness that had existed there before. Sometimes I drove past the empty lot where my grandparents' house had stood, needing to see the vacant space to confirm that the house really was gone and not just wishful thinking. Letters from prison still arrived occasionally, though less frequently as the years passed. My family members continued to maintain their innocence, continued to claim they were victims of persecution, continued to insist the system had been necessary and good. I stopped reading these letters after a while, having my mail screened by a service that filtered out correspondence from certain senders. There was no point in subjecting myself to their justifications and blame. Dr. Chen had helped me understand that I could not control whether they ever understood or acknowledged what they had done, that my recovery did not depend on their remorse or apologies. Some perpetrators never accept responsibility, she explained, and waiting for that acceptance would only keep me trapped in the past. The broader legal impact of our case extended far beyond individual convictions. Several states changed their laws regarding mandatory reporting, increased penalties for judicial corruption, and created special investigative units for networked family abuse. The FBI established a task force specifically focused on identifying and dismantling networks of organized abuse, using our case as a model for what to look for. Federal prosecutors presented at conferences about the investigation techniques that had been successful, helping other jurisdictions recognize similar patterns. Our case was cited in law school textbooks and used in training programs for social workers and law enforcement. The impact rippled outward in ways I could never have predicted when I first started recording audio through those heating vents. More survivors continued to come forward years after our trial concluded, reaching out after seeing media coverage or finding information online. Each person who contacted me represented another family's secret finally being exposed, another generation of abuse being stopped. I connected these survivors with resources, helped them understand legal options, listened to their stories with compassion earned through my own experiences. Some cases resulted in prosecutions, others in families quietly disbanding their traditions under threat of exposure. The network my grandfather had helped build was being systematically dismantled, piece by piece, family by family. It was slow work, frustrating work, but it was happening. Jessica graduated from high school with honors, having overcome incredible obstacles to succeed academically. Her foster family adopted her officially when she turned 16, giving her the stable, loving home she had never had before. She decided to study criminal justice in college, wanting to work in victim advocacy or prosecution eventually. During her graduation party, she pulled me aside and thanked me for saving her life, for being willing to destroy the family to protect her. I told her that she had saved herself too, that her courage in testifying and healing had inspired me to keep fighting. We took a photo together that day, both of us smiling genuinely, both of us free. 10 years after the trial, I found myself standing at a podium at a national conference on family violence, preparing to give a keynote speech about organized abuse networks. The audience was filled with social workers, therapists, prosecutors, and law enforcement officials, all wanting to learn from our case. I looked out at hundreds of faces and felt a moment of panic, wondering if I could actually do this, if I could tell this story one more time. Then I saw Christina sitting in the third row, smiling at me encouragingly. I saw Jessica near the back, having taken time off from college to attend. I saw Michelle, Laura, Jennifer, and Diana, all the survivors who had fought alongside me. I saw David, who had believed in us when nobody else would. I took a deep breath and began speaking, telling our story not as victims but as survivors. Not as people who had been broken, but as people who had broken a system that had operated unchallenged for 50 years. The work of healing is never truly finished, Dr. Chen had told me, and she was right. There were still hard days when memories ambushed me unexpectedly, when ordinary situations triggered panic attacks, when the weight of what had happened felt unbearable. But there were also good days, increasingly more good days than bad ones. Days when I felt proud of what we had accomplished, grateful for the life I was building, hopeful about the future. I had learned that recovery was not about erasing trauma or returning to who you were before. It was about integrating your experiences and building something new from the pieces that remained. It was about finding meaning in suffering, connection in isolation, strength in vulnerability. The basement rooms were empty now, demolished or sealed, no longer holding terrified girls in silver anklets. The traditions had been broken, exposed to light and judgment, rejected by younger generations who refused to perpetuate their family's sins. The network had been dismantled, its members imprisoned or ostracized, its secrets revealed to public scrutiny. And every single day, I woke up knowing that Jessica was safe, that Christina was healing, that other girls would never know the fear we had lived with. That knowledge, more than anything else, made everything worth it, made the nightmares bearable, made the years of fighting feel purposeful. We had broken the cycle, and that meant everything. Looking back now, I can see how every small act of courage built upon the previous one, creating a foundation strong enough to support the weight of bringing down an entire network. It started with listening through those vents, with refusing to pretend I did not hear what I was hearing. It continued with recruiting other girls, with learning to pick locks and map ventilation systems, with collecting evidence even when I was terrified of being caught. Each step seemed small and insignificant at the time, barely enough to make a difference. But together they formed a path from silence to exposure, from victimhood to agency, from isolation to community. I think about the girls who came before us, the ones whose remains were found in that sub-basement, the ones who did not survive long enough to see justice or freedom. I think about their families who were told they had run away, who spent years wondering where their daughters had gone, who never got closure or answers until federal investigators knocked on their doors decades later. Those girls deserved better than the silence that swallowed their stories, better than being forgotten and erased, better than dying alone in that room while their families celebrated holidays upstairs. Our fight was for them too, for the ones who could not speak anymore, whose voices had been permanently stolen by violence and time. The silver anklets that once marked girls for abuse now sit in evidence lockers, cataloged and photographed, preserved as proof of what happened. Sometimes I imagine them being discovered by historians 100 years from now. Imagine people trying to understand how such a system could have existed and operated so successfully for so long. I hope they will also find records of how it ended, testimonies from survivors who refused to accept that this was normal or necessary, documentation of the network being exposed and dismantled. I hope the story they tell is not just about the abuse, but about the resistance. Not just about the victims, but about the survivors who fought back. My relationship with the concept of family has fundamentally changed through all of this. I used to think family meant blood relatives who were supposed to protect and love you, but I learned that biology creates no obligation to accept abuse or maintain silence. The family I have built for myself now consists of David and Rachel, the other survivors who understand without explanation, colleagues who share my commitment to ending family violence, clients who trust me with their stories. This chosen family is based on mutual respect and genuine care, on people showing up for each other consistently, on safety and honesty instead of tradition and control. Blood may be thicker than water, as the old saying goes, but I have learned that the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb, that relationships built on choice and respect matter more than those built on genetic coincidence. Christina and I often talk about whether we would do it all again, knowing what we know now about the cost of exposing the network. The answer is always yes, without hesitation, because the alternative was unconscionable. The alternative was Jessica in that basement, was countless future girls being selected and broken, was the network continuing to operate and expand for another 50 years. The personal cost was high. We lost our families of origin. We carry trauma that affects us daily. We spent years in therapy working to recover pieces of ourselves that were damaged or destroyed. But the collective benefit was immeasurable. Dozens of girls were saved from abuse. A network that seemed invincible was destroyed. Legal systems were reformed to better protect vulnerable people. When the cost is measured against the benefit, there is no comparison. I sometimes wonder about the men in my family, about whether any of them ever questioned what they were participating in, or whether they genuinely believed it was necessary and good. My father had been raised in the system, had watched his father visit the basement room, had been taught that this was how families maintained peace and order. Did he ever lie awake at night questioning whether there might be another way? Or did the indoctrination run so deep that he never considered alternatives? My grandfather had created the system, had built that room with his own hands, had convinced himself he was solving a problem rather than creating a worse one. What kind of mental gymnastics did that require? What sort of self-deception allowed him to feel righteous about systematic torture? I will never have answers to these questions, but I think about them often, trying to understand how ordinary people convince themselves to do extraordinary evil. The impact on the extended family who were not directly involved in the abuse has been complicated and painful. Some cousins and relatives denounced what had happened and cut ties with anyone who defended the traditions, creating splits that will likely never heal. Others remained loyal to the imprisoned family members, continuing to insist that we had destroyed something valuable and necessary, that the younger generation did not understand the wisdom of the old ways. Family reunions no longer happen. Holidays are celebrated in fractured groups. Children are growing up not knowing half their relatives. This fragmentation was necessary but still sad, a recognition that some relationships were built on foundations too toxic to salvage. My work at the nonprofit has taught me that our case, while extreme in its organization and scope, was not unique in its dynamics. Families across the country and around the world maintain abusive traditions justified by religion, culture, necessity, or simple habit. Girls are still being raised to accept violence as love, to view their pain as service, to believe their worth lies in their willingness to suffer for others. The work of dismantling these systems one family at a time is slow and frustrating, requiring resources and commitment that are often in short supply. But every girl who escapes, every survivor who speaks up, every family tradition that ends contributes to broader cultural change. We are teaching a new generation that abuse is never justified, that tradition does not excuse cruelty, that families should be sources of support rather than suffering. Jessica visited me last month, driving 6 hours from her college to spend a weekend catching up. She is 23 now, confident and articulate, studying for the LSAT because she wants to become a prosecutor specializing in family violence cases. We walked through the park near my apartment, talking about her plans and dreams, and at one point she stopped and turned to me. "Do you know what the best part of my life is now?" she asked, and I shook my head, curious about her answer. "The best part is that I get to choose," she said. "I choose where I live and what I study and who I spend time with. I choose whether to answer phone calls or not. Choose what I eat for dinner. Choose when to go to bed." Those choices might seem small, but when you have spent your childhood preparing to have no choices at all, having them feels like the greatest gift imaginable. Her words captured something essential about recovery, about reclaiming agency and building a life based on your own desires rather than others' demands. The question I am asked most frequently when I speak at conferences or do media interviews is what advice I would give to someone who suspects family abuse is happening but is afraid to report it. My answer is always the same. Trust your instincts, Document everything you can and reach out to resources outside the family system. Abuse thrives in secrecy and isolation, so breaking that secrecy, even in small ways, begins to weaken the system. Tell a teacher, a counselor, a doctor, a trusted friend's parent. Make reports to Child Protective Services anonymously if you are afraid of retaliation. Take photos, keep journals, record conversations if it is legal in your state. Build a network of support before you take major action, because you will need people to believe in you and stand with you when your family turns against you. Most importantly, remember that you are not responsible for keeping your family together by maintaining silence, that their choice to abuse creates the problem, and your choice to report is simply revealing what already exists. Some people ask whether I ever feel guilty about the consequences my family members faced, whether I regret that my father and grandfather will die in prison. The honest answer is no. I do not feel guilt or regret about their imprisonment. They had decades to choose differently, to question the system they participated in, to consider the humanity of the girls they were hurting. They made their choices consistently and deliberately, believing themselves protected by wealth and connections and judicial corruption. The consequences they face now are the result of their own actions, not mine. I did not create the abuse. I simply stopped protecting them from accountability. If I feel anything about their imprisonment, it is relief that they cannot hurt anyone else, satisfaction that justice finally caught up with them, and peace knowing that their tradition died with their convictions. The work continues, even now, more than a decade after that Christmas dinner when everything changed. New survivors contact me regularly, some from families connected to the original network, others from similar systems operating independently. I connect them with resources, help them understand their options, remind them that speaking up is possible even when it feels impossible. Christina has become a powerful advocate. Her book about surviving and recovering from organized family abuse has helped thousands of people feel less alone. Jessica will graduate from law school next year and has already received job offers from prosecutors' offices in 3 states. The younger cousins have all found their own paths to healing and purpose, creating lives that reflect their own choices rather than their family's expectations. David passed away 2 years ago, his heart finally giving out after years of hard living and harder work. His funeral was attended by dozens of people whose lives he had touched through his investigations, families he had helped, survivors he had believed when nobody else would. I gave the eulogy, talking about how he had been more of a father to me than my biological one had ever been, how his commitment to justice had inspired me to continue fighting even when it seemed hopeless. Rachel and I still have our weekly dinners, still maintain the traditions we created to replace the toxic ones we escaped. She tells me often that her father considered me his greatest success, that helping dismantle the network gave his life's work meaning in a way nothing else had. Sometimes I drive past the empty lot where my grandparents' house once stood, the space now occupied by a small park with a playground where children shriek with laughter and parents watch from benches. Nobody playing there knows what used to exist on that ground, what suffering occurred in the basement beneath where they now play. I am glad they do not know. Glad that new memories are being built on top of old nightmares. Glad that innocence and joy have replaced violence and fear. The past cannot be erased, but it can be transformed, built over, repurposed into something better. That park represents hope to me, a physical manifestation of how light can replace darkness when people refuse to let evil continue unchallenged. On hard days, when the weight of everything feels too heavy, when nightmares wake me gasping at 3 a.m, when trauma responses are triggered by unexpected stimuli, I remind myself of what we accomplished. We broke a system that had operated successfully for 50 years. We saved Jessica and countless other girls from years of abuse. We exposed corruption that reached into multiple state judiciaries. We inspired legal reforms that will protect vulnerable people for generations to come. We proved that networks of abuse, no matter how well organized or well protected, can be dismantled by determined survivors willing to stand together. That is our legacy. Not the trauma we endured, but the courage we found. Not the violence done to us, but the justice we pursued. Not the family we lost, but the community we built in its place. The rooms are empty now, permanently, irrevocably empty. The silver anklets have been melted down and catalogued. The traditions have been broken and exposed to the light of public scrutiny. The network has been dismantled and its members imprisoned or ostracized. And every single day, girls wake up safe in homes where they will never be selected, never be locked in basements, never be taught that their suffering is necessary for others' peace. That reality, more than anything else, more than any personal achievement or accolade, gives meaning to everything we went through and everything we sacrificed to get here.